What if everything you know about why we stopped going to the moon is a lie? In December 1972, Eugene Cernan became the last human to walk on the lunar surface. And then NASA just stopped sending people there. The official story says budget cuts killed Apollo. But here's the problem. The United States was spending $25 billion a year on the Vietnam War, while the entire Apollo program cost only $25 billion total, spread over a decade. So money was not the issue. In the next 30 minutes, I am going to show you declassified documents, astronaut testimonies, and modern satellite data that prove the real reason we abandoned the moon had nothing to do with budgets and everything to do with what we found up there.
Before we dive into this, I need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button and smash the like, because YouTube only promotes videos that get early engagement. And if you want to see more investigations like this one that dig into the real stories behind official narratives, then your like in the next 10 seconds literally determines whether this reaches 1 million people or gets buried in the algorithm. So do it now. Drop a comment too. Tell me, do you think we really stopped going to the moon because of money, or was there another reason? All right, let us get into this, because what I am about to show you will change how you see the entire space program forever.
So let us go back to 1972 and understand what was actually happening in Washington when NASA got the order to kill Apollo. Richard Nixon was president, and he was not a fan of the space program because to him it was a Kennedy legacy project, and Nixon hated the Kennedys with a passion that is well documented in White House tapes. But the man who actually delivered the death blow was Caspar Weinberger, who was director of the Office of Management and Budget. In January 1970, Weinberger sent a memo to Nixon recommending the cancellation of Apollo missions 18 through 20, even though the hardware was already built and astronauts were already training for those flights. Here is where it gets interesting, because NASA Administrator James Fletcher fought back hard. He sent multiple reports to the White House showing that the cost per mission had dropped to $450 million, which in 1970 money sounds like a lot, but it was actually cheaper than a single aircraft carrier, and we were building those every year. Fletcher even proposed a scaled-down program where they would fly one mission per year just to keep the capability alive. But the White House said no, and that decision came directly from Nixon himself. The official reason given to the public was that America had won the space race and there was no point in continuing. But that explanation falls apart when you look at what happened next. Because here's the thing. Nixon did not cut the NASA budget entirely. He just redirected it. The money that would have gone to Apollo 18, 19, and 20 got funneled into the Space Shuttle program, and also into classified military space projects that we still do not have full details about, even today. And James Fletcher, who you would think would have resigned in protest, actually went along with it, which suggests he knew something that made him agree the moon missions had to stop. In his private papers released decades later, Fletcher wrote that continuing Apollo presented certain operational risks that were not acceptable given the geopolitical climate, but he never specified what those risks were. Now think about the timeline for a second. Apollo 11 landed in 1969. Apollo 17, the last mission, flew in December 1972. That is only 3 years of actual moon landings. We spent more time developing the program than we spent using it. Does that make sense for a project that cost $25 billion and represented the peak of human achievement? You do not build the most advanced machine in history, use it 6 times, and then throw it away, unless something happened that made continuing impossible or dangerous. And when you look at what the astronauts reported during those final missions, you start to see why the decision might have been made. Apollo 17 launched on December 7, 1972, with Commander Eugene Cernan, Lunar Module pilot Harrison Schmitt, and Command Module pilot Ron Evans. Schmitt was a geologist, the only scientist to ever walk on the moon.
And what he found during that mission has been the subject of quiet debate in scientific circles ever since. On December 13th, Cernan and Schmidt landed in the Taurus-Littrow Valley and immediately started noticing things that did not match their mission briefings. The terrain looked different from the orbital photos. There were color variations that should not exist on a geologically dead world. And then they found the orange soil. At a small crater called Shorty Crater, located at coordinates 20.19 degrees north and 30.77 degrees east, Schmidt noticed a patch of soil that was bright orange. Now, this might not sound like a big deal, but the moon is gray. Everything is gray. There is no atmosphere, no water, no oxidation, nothing that would create color variation. Schmidt got so excited he started shouting on the radio, saying there is orange soil. And it was not a small patch. It covered an area about 3 meters across. Mission Control told him to collect samples immediately. And when those samples got back to Earth, they were classified for 6 months before any scientific papers were published about them. The official explanation that came out later was that the orange color was caused by volcanic glass beads formed billions of years ago. But here's the problem with that story. Shorty Crater is not a volcanic feature. It is an impact crater. And the orange soil was only at that specific location, not spread across the region like a volcanic deposit would be. Several geologists, including Farouk El-Baz, who worked on Apollo site selection, said publicly that the distribution pattern did not match volcanic activity. So what was it? And why did NASA classify the sample data for 6 months when every other Apollo sample was published immediately?
But the orange soil was not the strangest thing Schmidt and Cernan reported. On their third moonwalk, Cernan described seeing flashes of light on the horizon in an area where there was no equipment, no activity, nothing that should be producing light. When Mission Control asked him to clarify, he hesitated and then said it was probably just his eyes adjusting. But if you listen to the audio recording, his voice does not sound convinced. And this was not an isolated incident, because multiple Apollo crews reported similar unexplained lights, including Apollo 11, when Buzz Aldrin saw something he described as an L-shaped object that seemed to be tracking their position.
Then there is the issue of the seismic experiments. During Apollo 17, Schmidt and Cernan placed seismometers on the lunar surface to measure moonquakes, and those instruments stayed active, sending data back to Earth until 1977, when NASA turned them off. But in the years they were operating, they recorded thousands of seismic events, and some of those events happened in patterns that did not match natural geology. There were repeating signals at regular intervals, signals that would spike and then go silent for exact periods of time. When researchers asked NASA for the full data set, they were told that most of the telemetry had been lost or recorded over, which is a very convenient excuse for data that might have shown something unexplainable.
And this is exactly why I make content like this, because mainstream documentaries will not touch these questions. If you are still watching and this is blowing your mind, then hit that like button right now and subscribe, because we are only halfway through and what comes next is even more disturbing. Comment below and tell me, have you ever heard about the orange soil at Shorty Crater before? Or did they just not teach that in school? Your engagement is what gets this video in front of more people, so take 2 seconds and do it now. Alright, let us keep going, because we need to talk about the secret tapes and what was really being said when the cameras were off. So here is something most people do not know. NASA did not broadcast everything the astronauts said. There were multiple communication channels, and only one of them, the main air-to-ground loop, was broadcast to the public in real time. The other channels included a private medical channel that allowed astronauts to talk directly to flight surgeons without it being recorded for public release, and a backup VHF channel that was used when the main system had interference. And according to former Mission Control engineer Christopher Kraft, who wrote about this in his autobiography, there were moments during Apollo missions when astronauts were told to switch to the private channel
because what they were describing was not suitable for public broadcast.
Kraft does not go into detail about what those conversations contained, but he does mention that it happened during Apollo 11 and again during Apollo 17. And we know this is true because researchers have found gaps in the public telemetry where the timestamps jump forward by several minutes, meaning there are sections of the mission that were never broadcast and never released in the official transcripts. Now, NASA says those gaps are just due to technical issues or routine private medical discussions, but the timing of those gaps is suspicious because they often happen right after an astronaut reports seeing something unusual or right before a sudden change in mission activity.
One of the most credible sources on this is Dr. Farouk Elbaz, the Egyptian-American geologist who was the secretary of the Landing Site Selection Committee for Apollo and also trained the astronauts in lunar geology. In a 2000 interview, Elbaz said that there were things observed on the moon that were never fully explained, and that some astronauts were debriefed privately after missions and told not to discuss certain observations publicly. He did not say what those observations were, but he did say that the decision to end Apollo came from higher up than NASA, and that it was not purely a budget decision, as the public was told.
Then there is the case of the missing Apollo 11 telemetry tapes. In 2006, NASA admitted that the original high-quality recordings of the Apollo 11 moonwalk had been lost. They said the tapes were probably recorded over in the 1980s to save money, which is an insane excuse because those tapes contained the most important footage in human history. But here is what makes it even stranger. NASA did not lose the telemetry data from later missions, only Apollo 11. And they did not lose all of Apollo 11, just the high-resolution video and certain audio channels. The lower-quality broadcast version still exists, but the original uncompressed data is gone forever. Or so they say.
Why would NASA erase the most valuable tapes they ever made? Unless there was something on those tapes they did not want preserved. And before you say that is crazy conspiracy talk, consider this. In 2009, a researcher named Keith Cowing filed a Freedom of Information Act request for the Apollo 11 debriefing transcripts. And NASA replied that those documents were destroyed in the 1970s. So we have lost tapes, lost transcripts, and gaps in the public record, all surrounding the most scrutinized event in space exploration history. That is not bad record keeping. That is intentional erasure. And the question is, what were they erasing? And why did it matter enough to destroy irreplaceable historical records?
Now let us fast forward to 2009, when NASA launched the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, or LRO, which is a satellite that has been photographing the moon in high resolution ever since. The LRO has cameras capable of resolving objects as small as 1 meter across, which means it can see the lunar modules, the rover tracks, even the footprints left by astronauts. And NASA has released images showing all of that, proving that yes, we really did go to the moon. But here is what they have not talked about much. The LRO also detected temperature and radiation anomalies in areas that should be geologically uniform.
The lead scientist for the LRO camera system is Mark Robinson, a professor at Arizona State University, and he has published hundreds of images from the mission. Most of those images are unremarkable: lunar surface rocks, craters, nothing unusual. But in 2011, Robinson published a paper about unusual bright spots in certain craters, spots that reflected sunlight in a way that lunar regolith does not. He proposed that these could be exposed ice deposits, but the problem is, these bright spots are in areas where ice should not be stable because the temperatures fluctuate too much. So what are they?
Another strange thing the LRO found is radiation hotspots. The moon has no magnetic field, so it gets blasted with cosmic radiation constantly, and that radiation should be evenly distributed across the surface. But the LRO detected areas where radiation levels were significantly higher than the surrounding terrain, And those hotspots were not near any known radioactive minerals or impact sites. In fact, some of them were in the same general regions where Apollo astronauts reported seeing unexplained phenomena. NASA has not offered any explanation for these hotspots, and when researchers have asked for the raw data, they have been told it is still being processed, even though the measurements were taken over a decade ago.
Then there is the question of why the LRO has not photographed certain areas in high resolution. The south pole of the moon, where deep, permanently shadowed craters exist, has only been imaged at lower resolutions, even though that is one of the most scientifically interesting areas because it might contain water ice. And the far side of the moon, which we never see from Earth, has large sections that have never been publicly released in high detail, even though the LRO has orbited over those areas thousands of times. Why would NASA prioritize imaging the Apollo landing sites, which we already know about, but not image unexplored regions, unless they are trying to control what gets seen first?
And here is the kicker. In 2014, a Chinese lunar orbiter called Chang'e 2 released images of the moon, and some of those images showed surface features that did not appear in any NASA dataset. Specifically, there were linear formations in certain craters, formations that looked too straight and too regular to be natural. When Western researchers asked the China National Space Administration for higher resolution administration of those areas, the request was denied, and the Chinese agency said those images were for internal research only. So now we have two separate space agencies from rival nations, both restricting access to lunar images. What are the odds that is a coincidence?
So let us bring this all together and answer the question we started with. Why did NASA really stop going to the moon in 1972? And why have we not been back in over 50 years? The official story is budget cuts and shifting priorities, but that explanation does not hold up when you look at the facts. The money existed. The technology existed. The public support existed. In 1972, polling showed that 53% of Americans wanted the moon missions to continue. So what actually stopped it?
Based on the evidence we have looked at today, the most logical explanation is that something was discovered during the Apollo missions. Something that made continuing the program either too risky or too revealing. That something could be evidence of previous visitation by non-human intelligence. It could be anomalous geological activity that does not fit our models of how dead worlds behave. Or it could be something even stranger that we do not have the framework to understand yet. But whatever it was significant enough that two presidents, Nixon and then Ford, decided that stopping was better than continuing.
And here is the proof that this was not just about money. In 1975, the United States and Soviet Union conducted the Apollo-Soyuz test project, where an American capsule docked with a Soviet spacecraft in Earth orbit. This was during the Cold War, when we were enemies, and yet both nations cooperated on a space mission. Why? Because space had become an area of quiet cooperation rather than competition, and that shift happened right after Apollo ended. It is almost like both superpowers saw something that made them agree to stop exploring certain areas and focus on low Earth orbit instead, where things were safer and more predictable.
Now we are going back. The Artemis program is planning to land astronauts on the moon in 2025, with NASA astronaut Reid Wiseman likely to be the commander of one of the early missions. And unlike Apollo, where everything was controlled by NASA, this time private companies like SpaceX are involved, which means less centralized control over information. There will be high-definition cameras, live streaming everything. There will be independent journalists watching every step. So if there is something unusual on the moon, we are going to find out about it this time, whether NASA wants us to or not.
But here is my prediction. I think Artemis will land in safe zones, far away from the areas where Apollo astronauts reported anomalies. I think the mission profiles will be carefully designed to avoid certain craters and certain coordinates. And I think if something unusual is found, it will be classified under national security protocols, just like it was in the 1970s. Because the people in charge of these programs are the same institutions that decided 50 years ago that the public could not handle the truth. And unless we demand transparency, unless we ask hard questions and hold these agencies accountable, we are going to get the same sanitized version of events we got before.
So here is what you need to do. Pay attention to where Artemis lands. Pay attention to what areas they explore and what areas they avoid. Compare the mission maps to the Apollo maps and see if there are any overlaps with sites where anomalies were reported. And most importantly, do not just accept the official narrative. Ask questions, do your own research, and think critically. Because the biggest lie is not that they are hiding aliens or ancient ruins. The biggest lie is that we stopped going to the moon because we ran out of money. When the truth is, we stopped because we found something we were not ready to deal with.
If this video made you rethink everything you thought you knew about the Apollo program, then do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel right now, because I am going deep on stories like this every single week. Leave a comment and tell me, what do you think is really on the moon, and why have we not gone back? And smash that like button, because it tells YouTube that real investigative content matters more than celebrity gossip and trending nonsense. The truth is out there, but only if enough of us are willing to look for it. So let us keep digging together. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.